But if they say Simon says, raise your hand, then of course you're supposed to do that. Well, what if we played the game instead of Simon says, parents say, raise your right hand? And really, biblically, that's what Paul is going to tell us, is that we actually obey our parents. It's not that we think about it, and if they say the magic word, then we may do it. But really, what does it mean to obey our parents? We continue our Flourishing Family series. We've addressed marriage. We've addressed the husbands. Last week we addressed the wives. And now children, it's your turn. And by children, some of you children may be 50 years old or 70 years old, because there's a word really for all of us, whatever stage in life that we may find ourselves this morning. Again, let's listen to one couple in our church, Murphy and Will, as they talk about what it's like having small children still at home.
Because we were married for, 3 years probably before we had first kid. So, just right at 3 years. And so we got to experience that time before kids and then after kids, and it changed everything completely. Because it's like before you can kind of not have as much responsibility, you can coast, and all of a sudden you get hit with a kid and you just get smacked in the face. And it's like, okay, you got to really pony up and decide you're going to work together as a team.
I think when I first became a parent, I was like, it's about the kid and the kid's going to figure this out. But truly, it's a lot of hard work on yourself and how you portray yourself and how you make choices and how you filter your thoughts, and when you wake up to be in the Word and put on the armor of God. And it's really hard because you have little ones watching you and who want to model that and model what you do. And so I think being a parent's much more than
and fighting for the ability to teach them that their identity is in Christ and their significance comes from Christ, and it's not these other worldviews that we're dealing with now, and keep them rooted in what is true. Our kids are 3 and 1.5, who doesn't really necessarily, can't have a conversation with him yet. The 3-year-old, you can, and it's, but she's obviously still so small. The work still is there to be done, and I think it is sweet when she's at daycare during the church service, on Sundays, and she goes to preschool at the church, and she comes home with Bible verses to memorize and things like that, and she's learned how to pray, which I think was one of the biggest things. Now she wants to pray at dinner because she learned how to pray at her preschool at West U, and it's okay, she's developing this concept of who God is, and God is a father, and I want to pray to him and go to him, and I'm that's huge, so now we just have to build off of that.
I think just modeling what you want to see, praying over dinner and praying at night, and then showing her oh, well, let's pray for your friend who broke their foot, and stopping for people in need, doing service projects.
Serving with them.
Yeah, serving with them. If it's a beautiful day, we say, oh, God made it such a beautiful day. So just things like that, and have that end goal. We both know where we want our kids to go and where we want them to be. And so just always when you get off course, just knowing, okay, well, this is what we want, and we can get back on track.
Okay, we've already looked at 13 verses there toward the end of Ephesians 5, and we're going to kick over into Ephesians 6 this morning. And if you've been with us this series, you've heard me say repeatedly that oftentimes we struggle because we want to apply someone else's instruction for them. For example, husbands like to read the part, wives, submit to your husbands. And wives like to read the part, husbands, love your wives. And again, I call that reading someone else's mail. Well, again, the mail that we have looked at, it has had a recurring word, submit. Now, verse 21 talks about mutual submission, and we talked about that briefly. Verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands. Verse 23, again, it talks about being subject even as the church is to Christ. Well, we get into chapter 6, and there's a different word, and it's the word obey. And it's not the same word. And so children, of course, should submit to their parents, but even more than that, children should obey their parents. The Bible gives us instruction on the order and responsibility of those in authority in the home, fathers, mothers, and then children. And again, it was written in a context where children had zero authority. And in fact, when the child was born, the child was put at the feet of the father in many cultures, and the father either reached down and picked up the child to symbolize, yes, this child can live, or turned his back to say the child should not live, and they would just simply put the child outside in the elements. And so again, it was a different context, and yet the words are still viable and instructive for us today. Again, order and responsibility, not value and worth. Now very quickly, we need to address the reality of today. Out where I pastor Missouri City, probably half the children have only one parent at home. So listen carefully. Mom, sometimes you are mom and dad. And dads, occasionally it falls on you to be dad and mom. But again, I believe these words are instructive. And as I say each time, we are a church that we want to come alongside of you if you have to be mom and dad, or dad and mom. And out where we live, actually a huge percentage of children are being raised either primarily or secondarily by grandparents. So again, the Bible has something to say to all of us as we work and love our children. Well, what does Paul say to children? Well, again, the letter has been delivered, and I'm going to open it, and kids, this is what the Apostle Paul wrote. Dear children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may turn out well for you and that you may live long on the earth. Sincerely, Paul. Did you catch the words there? Two key words, kids, and kids again, kids of all ages. Obey and honor. Similar but different. They're not identical. So children, obey your parents. As I said last week, in a culture where wives, quote, had to submit in a way to their husbands, why did Paul say you should submit? It was for willing submission. Well, children the same. In that culture, children basically had to obey their parents. I mean, you talk about being punished. It wasn't time out. It could be very severe. But why would Paul write to children, some small, some teenagers, some older? Again, willful obedience. Obedience by desire. Again, as a parent, as a grandparent, it is our responsibility to help children learn to obey. Now it goes on to talk about fathers don't exasperate your children. It does talk about parents should lead in a Christ-like way, but that doesn't always mean children agree. And in fact, it often means they don't. And that's where obedience comes in, even sometimes when understanding and oftentimes when agreement is not reached. You know, God has you in your current family for a reason. You know, I've met children who think somehow there were a mistake, or somehow their family situation took God by surprise. No. And I'm not saying that all family situations are ideal, and I'm not saying that all are honoring the Lord, because not all are. But I do want to say that God is sovereign. That's a big word, means He's in control, and that for some reason He has placed you there, maybe with a single parent, maybe with both parents, maybe with a grandparent. And He hasn't forgotten you. He sees you where you are, and He still sends you these words. Obey. Obey your parents. Obey those who are in authority in your home. Again, sometimes it's challenging, but it's a choice of obedience. Now again, disobedience does not simply lead to relational issues, but it can lead down a path of destruction. Again, I could tell story after story. I have gotten phone calls from jail. I have tried to help young people who got on the wrong road. And it's often easy to predict what will happen because the predicted behavior goes back to the home. Has the child learned to obey his mom and dad? If he hasn't, then why is he going to obey a teacher, a principal, an officer, a government official? Well, it just stands to reason. And so there is great value in learning early obedience, to obey the one who has been given authority by the Lord. Again, choices have consequences. And even as children, making the wrong choices can lead to greater pain than you would ever imagine. So children, obey your parents. Learn to obey early. And again, this is a different relationship. A husband to wife relationship is not the same as a father to son or daughter, or mother to son or daughter. It is to lead to loving obedience. Many of you know I served nearly 3 decades as a missionary. And so I love to see how other cultures operate and work. And even learning other languages, it was always fascinating to me how sometimes there wasn't an exact word, and so you had to kind of make adjustments. Well, I heard about a missionary in Africa, and he couldn't find a word, obey. They didn't have a simple one-to-one. And he was walking with some of his African friends into a village, and he whistled for his dog. And his dog ran up to him immediately, and the African friend said, "Your dog is all ear." And he realized that's what obedience is. In that culture, it means to be all ear. Again, in Poland, where I learned to speak Polish, their word for to obey is related to their word to listen, which again is interesting, that it's listening with the heart and reacting with the heart. It's not just verbal processes going on in your mind, but it's that you follow through with obedience. Now again, in our present culture, sometimes there's a negative view, even a negotiation for obedience, and I see it with children. Okay, I'll obey you if you give me this, I'll go to bed. Or and we need to teach that obedience is right because it's right. It's not a negotiated settlement. And again, I'm not speaking of harshness, I'm just speaking of clarity. Unfortunately, I meet many parents who want so much to be their child's friend that they forget to be their parent. Your child will have other friends, they only have 2 parents. And so we need to take the responsibility, not just to set an example, but to be clear and consistent, explaining boundaries and why the children need to follow and obey. I came across a story I thought was fascinating. An aviation cadet there in the Air Force was learning to fly, and he was on one of his first solo flights, and he had a condition that they say is not normal, but it occasionally hits, where because of stress and altitude, different things, he literally went blind. Now, he later regained his sight, but he was blind by himself in the plane. And so, of course, he radios down, and the officer radios back, "Follow my instructions exactly." And he tells him how to bank, where to turn, how to line up. He's on the runway, and he brings him in, and he actually lands perfectly there. Now, how foolish it would be if he said, "Well, I don't want to go that way. I want to go the other way. I want to come in from the south, not the north." No, what he did was he just followed step by step, and it actually brought life. Again, that's what obedience, true obedience does. It doesn't hinder us. It actually frees us. I learned in leadership sometimes people would give me the place of decision, not that they couldn't, but they were freed from it when I had to make a decision. And children sometimes need to be freed from certain decisions. Again, I've heard parents say, "Well, I'll let my kid decide whether he goes to church." Well, do you let your kid decide whether he goes to the dentist? Do you let your kid decide whether he goes to school? Unfortunately, I've met some parents who do, and it's just a wrong situation. And so, yeah, we need to teach proper patterns, and as they obey proper patterns, there comes a time they have to make their own decisions. But again, there have been, as it were, grooves in their brain that generally leads to wisdom instead of to folly. Again, children, you serve well in your family by obedience and by submission. And children, let me just tell you this. There'll come a day, and it's hard to believe, especially if you're 8, 10, 12 years old, that if your parent lives long enough, that they will be frail and you will be stronger. And they may be bedridden, or they may be in a special assisted living place. Then all of a sudden you find yourself being the caregiver. And when you're in that situation, you want to look back with the memory of support and obedience of them, even as you tend to their needs. And that gets more into the honoring your mother and father, which I'll get to in just a moment. In fact, I read an article, and I'll read from it, which kind of gives these 2 terms in parallel. It says, "The distinction between obeying and honoring is important. Obedience carries with it the idea of absolute trust and absolute submission. It means to put oneself under the authority of another and to follow the commands or guidance of that person. In the Bible, this is frequently used in reference to a child learning from a parent or God's people learning from God. Honoring someone is different than obeying or submitting to them. Honoring means showing esteem and respect to someone of superior standing. What that means is you show respect, you show reverence. That's what it means to honor. You place value on your mother and on your father. And again, as we reach adulthood, really we no longer obey our parents in a sense, because now we have our new family, and our father nor our mothers should dictate to us how we live as husbands or wives or moms or dads ourselves. But we never quit honoring our mothers and our fathers. In fact, that's the direct wording from Exodus 20 that Paul is quoting here when you get to Ephesians 6, 1 and 2. And don't miss this. Children, honor your father and your mother. Again, in that society, mothers were lesser in the household, but in God's economy, the honor goes to both. And so we need to never forget that. And again, that's whether our mother and father are in their 30s or in their 80s or 90s, that it is our place to show them honor. Well, again, honor starts with obedience, especially as children, but it grows to much more. Your attitude, your treatment of your mother and father. Because the truth is, sometimes you can obey your parents and not honor them. You probably know what I'm talking about. That you obey them, you go wash the dishes, but you give them that evil eye the whole time. Or you obey them by sitting at the table doing your homework, but you're muttering under your breath the whole time, this is stupid, I don't want to do this homework, why does my mom make me do this homework? And so there is a difference, and it should be both. Yeah, we obey and we honor, we esteem, we value them highly because of who they are. Interestingly, Jesus actually called the religious leaders of his days sometimes not honoring their parents. And again, that's hard to believe, because in the Jewish nation, that was a very high value. And they were sometimes looking for ways to get around there. And so in Mark, the Gospel of Mark chapter 7, he points out, he says, you act religious and you act like you keep the law, but one of the basic laws is honoring your mom and your dad, and you break it. And what they would do is they would take their valuable items, their wealth, their possessions, whatever it may be, and they would pronounce upon it, this is korban, which was a word that meant this is a gift to God. So, since it's a gift designated, I can't give it to my mom and dad. And again, remember in that day there wasn't Social Security. There was no retirement program from the government. And so elderly parents, older parents were supported by, especially their sons, but by their children. And so if a son were to say, instead of supporting my parents, I'm going to dedicate this, and sometimes it's dedicated to the temple. Sometimes religious leaders would get involved and have them do that instead of giving it to their parents. Sometimes they would make use of it themselves and try to give some rationale that it was God's leading them to do that. And so Jesus pointed out, so that's hypocritical, that's sinful, and that's wrong, that you need to foundationally honor your father and your mother. Again, we all know of difficult and costly situations, especially as Americans live longer. My own mother had Alzheimer's. I know of story after story where people had to move maybe an elderly mother or elderly father back into their home. Sometimes there were physical challenges, sometimes mental, sometimes both. It can be draining mentally, emotionally, financially. Recently I heard of an elderly mom, grandmother, that quit eating, and for 72 days the family sat next to her day after day after day. And it's just taxing, and yet it's the right thing to do. And I don't say it's the easy thing to do. It's not. But that's what honoring our mother and father sometimes will look like. And sometimes we just simply pray the Lord's strength upon us, maybe extended family, so that we do that well and we honor them. Again, that is God's call to us, is to give honor to the generation before us. Like a story I read about an economist. He was actually born in Canada, but he moved to the States, became a naturalized citizen, became ambassador to India. His name was Kenneth Galbraith. And the story is told that one day he came home from work early afternoon. He was exhausted, had been up most of the night, and he was coming into his home, and he told his housekeeper, whose name was Emily, I've got to rest. Just please hold all my calls. Well, as he laid down and went to sleep, about 30 minutes later, the phone rang, and she picks it up, and it was President Lyndon Johnson. And he said, I want to speak to Galbraith. And she said, I'm sorry, he's sleeping. Well, go wake him up. And the housekeeper Emily said, no, sir. She said, I work for him, I don't work for you. And hung up the phone on the President of the United States. And again, that was a show of honoring, of course, her employer as well as her friend. Again, Paul quotes from Exodus, and he points out here as well, honor your father and your mother. And he goes on to say why, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long in the land. Again, it's the first with the promise is also underscored there. Promise language actually can be difficult in the Bible because one may treat a promise like an oath or a covenant or a requirement, and it becomes difficult at that point. Some interpret Exodus 20 as a promise for the nation, because again, it's one of the 10 commandments called the 10 words originally in the Hebrew language, to honor your father and your mother. And so there was this promise that if Israel would honor their parents, that it would go well with them, that they would live long in the land that was promised. Others do make it an individual application. I would just give clarity here that many times promises are really principles. That the principle's true, that one who submits to the authority of their father and mother generally will have a better life, a more God-honoring life, and therefore blessed life that may end up long life. And I say it that way because I have heard people say, my 23-year-old sister was killed in a car accident, and she honored our mother and father. Why didn't she live a long life? And sometimes we can get caught up in that, but the principles are still true, that God blesses obedience and God blesses honoring of our father and mother. Again, as I started this message, that in the children's game, Simon says, it seems like our ears are peaked and we listen carefully for the magic words and then we obey. Well, let me just encourage you, children, that when you hear the words from your parents, may they be magic words toward obedience. And again, children, whatever age you may be, pray for the strength to honor your father and mother as long as they live. Would you pray with me? And Father, I thank you for the principles of Scripture. Lord, they're not arbitrary, and they don't just bring strength to an individual, to a family, but also to a church and to a nation. And I pray that we will instill in our children, first, a desire to obey because they see loving parents. And for our children, I pray you'll protect them from the many voices that are pulling them away from a biblical obedience. And Father, help their eyes to be turned strictly to you, and that you